Welcome, everybody. We're very excited about the strong turnout that we've had at this event, this fireside chat with Stefan Vilsmeier from Brainlab. Basically, the setup we have in mind here is that I'm going to do a very quick introduction. I'm going to turn it over to Stefan to tell us a little bit about Brainlab, who they are and what they do. And then we'll start a Q&A. The first kind of half of the Q&A is going to be between me and Stefan, and then I will moderate some questions from the audience. So looks like our number of participants is climbing. Okay, so I'll just get started right now. We're very grateful to have Stefan Vilsmeier joining us from Brainlab. He's served as Brainlab's president and CEO and has been the driving force behind the company's innovation and customer focus. Brainlab is a MedTech company that develops software and hardware for radiotherapy and radiosurgery, and focusing on the surgical fields of neurosurgery, ear, nose, and throat, and craniomaxillofacial, spine surgery, and traumatic interventions. With hospitals in Asia, North America, and South Africa as some of its first customers, Brainlab has been an international company from the very beginning. Today, Brainlab generates more than 50% of its revenues in the US, and has strategic partnerships with some of the world's leading healthcare companies. Vilsmeier has evolved the company's vision beyond software solutions for medical treatments that are more precise, less invasive, and less expensive than traditional methods. Brainlab is now able to bring entire medical centers to a new level of integration and patient care by providing the infrastructure and support for state-of-the-art access and management of digital medical information. In March 2021, Brainlab acquired Mint Medical, a Heidelberg-based company that develops image reading and reporting software for clinical routine and research, underscoring Brainlab's commitment to digital health and aims to improve the structured diagnosis, analysis, and treatment of cancer and other diseases to address the demands of modern medicine and personalized treatments. With that, I will turn it over to Stefan. Tell us a little bit about Brainlab, who they are and what they do, and then we'll launch into the Q&A.
So, thanks for the introduction, and I'm really excited to be with you, virtually this evening. And I want to probably first tell you about how to get in the idea of writing software for brain surgery, which isn't what most people pick as their, destiny in life. And I will talk about what Brainlab does today and why I believe that we're almost at a very interesting inflection point where the role of digitization in healthcare is really taking off, and there's just exciting opportunities ahead. So, it all started with my first computer, which was Commodore 64, that I got at the age of 15. And if you don't start at 7 or 8, you're never going to be very good at software. And I was probably the worst software engineer to ever work at Brainlab, but I knew whom to hire. And with 16, I wrote a book on 3D software, which published 50,000 copies in the first year. And that book resulted in my being invited by the University of Vienna to join them for some special computer project. And through that project, I saw the first images from CT and MRI, and I couldn't believe that this high precision from those images wasn't used in a more meaningful way for surgery, that people would put up those images in a light box in the corner of the room and start surgery manually with what they had memorized. So for me, it was clear that software was the missing link to fully exploit that accuracy. So I had started studying computer science at the Technical University of Munich, but I dropped out of college after 20 days by recognizing the potential of basically software in medicine, and by burning the bridges to a reasonable life and a career, by creating this, I would say, artificial crisis. I had no other chance but to succeed with what I started. So the first software of Brainlab tried to generate a digital model of basically a neurosurgical anatomy to plan a stereotatic procedure, which was involving calculating angles for approaching a brain tumor through a particular pathway, something that was maybe the first effort of using software in neurosurgery. In fact, most neurosurgeons believed 30 years ago that they're not good neurosurgeons if they were dependent on software. Today, a neurosurgeon is not a good neurosurgeon to do basically the majority of the procedures without the proper software, and mostly software from Brainlab. So fortunately for Brainlab, times have changed, and we launched really a company in a very unlikely environment where it was really a bizarre idea, but we kept adding other technologies and products over the years, because basically what we started with today is less than 1% of our total revenues. So the starting capital of the company was more or less the proceeds of the book, which was about 75,000 euros, which was a fortune for maybe a 19-year-old at the time. And the reason why I actually incorporated or started a company, because you can't write software for brain surgery and be personal liable. So I tried to shield liability by having a limited corporation, so to speak. And I always felt that I wanted to find distributors and other people to sell my product, which basically I failed, and I realized that I wasn't able to really sell anything unless I tried myself. And something I didn't like, or I didn't think I was basically even remotely qualified to do. I'm actually by nature an introvert, so basically selling and being in front of customers is for me an awkward and less than natural thing. And so I really had to push myself out of the comfort zone and basically just get involved in selling things myself, hire a few people, hire a few more people, and this is how the company started to grow. Also, venture capital and other sources of funding were very limited, basically, at least in Europe 30 years ago. So, and it was also an environment where you could not even declare personal bankruptcy. So if you start a business and that doesn't turn out, then basically you're going to be paying for the rest of your life and will never, own a cent. So I started with basically bank loans that I had to personally guarantee. That guarantee went up to 80 times of my annual net salary over the years. But I was, fearless and yeah, maybe today I would say probably stupid to some extent, and really tried to push forward and basically silver the company. So after I've used up most of the proceeds of that book in 1992, I basically graduated from high school in 87. I started the company in 89. So in 92, I used the remaining few $1,000s to build an exhibit booth in my parents' house garage. I said, basically, I shipped everything as luggage on the flight to the US. I basically have been basically then setting it up myself, the exhibit booth, and basically we're able to get the first customer relationships in customers all over the world. As you have basically just mentioned, it was customers all over the world, and that basically started our global journey. Today, Brainlab has 6,200 hospitals using its technology in 120 countries, and we really consider about 7,000 hospitals doing serious type of surgeries. So from that perspective, 6,200 out of 7,000 is a pretty good hit rate, a high percentage of hospitals where we're digitally entrenched. And so the role of digital surgery and digital transformation has really increased. So, but in order to tell you more about our technology and the scope and idea and the direction that the company is taking, I thought that it's better if I just did that by sharing basically some presentation, because yeah, then this way you get a better sense of what we do. So what you see here is the first software from Brainlab, basically 30 years ago, running on a Commodore Amiga. There was before, there was a Pentium chip and Windows 3.1. So we used what was available at that point, and what we tried to generate out of CT and MRI images is the model of patients' anatomy. And so we tried to create a digital model and where we can calculate angles, distances, volumes. So we made the anatomy computer processable. So something that we still do today, but we do it at scale. And so the idea behind everything we do is basically creating some GPS system of the human body. And with any, like with Google Maps, for example, you would have the map and the navigation technology, but then there is also a whole statistical layer that really drives everything you're doing. And then finally, if you look at what makes Google Maps so powerful, there's the entire video domain along with it, and all of those four areas are connected. So every time you pull up your phone to scan your environment, it basically through the navigation and the maps is linked to the statistical layer and feeds that statistical layer. And in a nutshell, Brainlab has created the same in neurosurgery. And a lot of the 6,200 hospitals, basically over 5,500 of them, use our technology in neurosurgery. And that's basically our largest installed base, where we have a very healthy market share. And so looking at the different components, first of all, we have the anatomical mapping, the coming up with basically a universal anatomical address that's assigned to every single pixel, every single voxel, making the anatomy computer readable. So very similar to when you run an OCR software over a scanned-in document, which makes it a document searchable, we're making the anatomy searchable. So that means we are able to generate much nicer 3D images, and almost like as a byproduct, which basically means we can understand the semantic context of the anatomy. We can peel away the different layers of anatomy, like the different layers of an onion, which basically really means we inherently understand the anatomy when we process it. And then there's, of course, the tracking what's going on in the operating room, which basically means we deploy almost like some sort of swarm intelligence to take sensors from infrared tracking cameras and microscopes and robotic joints and electromagnetic tracking to all map what's going on in the OR. So this is what our navigation systems in neurosurgery today look like. And here you see then basically a pointer with reflective marker spheres that are being picked up by the cameras. And as you move your instrument over the patient's anatomy, you can see what you are tracking and outlining. And as you basically insert a catheter into the brain, for example, you are not only tracking that catheter in that particular patient's anatomy, but you are at the same time generating knowledge, in theory, across all the patients that are available. And so now for a neurosurgeon, the mother of all things is the microscope. And a microscope image without Brainlab looks like that in neurosurgery. With Brainlab, we can overlay the anatomy driven by knowing the anatomical vector of what we're looking at. And, everybody believes that an important future in this field is going to be using AI and machine learning to understand the anatomy, but, knowing the anatomical vector that we're looking at in a universal sense basically also means that we're in a much stronger, position. And so that was what we've done in neurosurgery. But how do we get out of this domain? We've started to equip thousands of ORs with a digital OR system, which is a set of large screens where we capture video data as well as the anatomical data and get that all basically connected. So there is, even in New York, over 100 operating rooms all wired and equipped across different subspecialties, with that. And then, of course, accessing video basically gives then the foundation for AI-based processing of instruments and events and landmarks. But then there's also robotic solutions that we've developed on our own, and imaging solutions that are basically extending our portfolio beyond neurosurgery, and especially in the area of spine, which is a huge growth market for us right now. But if you look at still cranial and spine altogether are still a very small percentage of what the total scope and the potential is basically for that. So similar to how maybe Amazon has created AWS as a B2B platform business to deploy its core technology to other parties, Brainlab has created a spin-off called Snake OS, where we took 100 companies, 100 employees, moved them in a separate entity, double the size of a company in the first 12 months or so, to basically create an operating system of surgery, generalizing what I've just explained, so that other companies in other domains could basically use our technology as a starting point. And a big component moving forward of all of that is everything around data. I think that the future of healthcare is going to be driven by data. I think if you look at the demographic development of basically healthcare basically most of the developed markets, and I think it's impossible that we can get the same type of medical care that we expect without basically higher efficiency, which is going to be data driven. And this, for example, is what the German cancer registry looks like. It's a paper form that you fill out, and maybe it's somewhat more advanced in the US, but if you look across the globe, many markets are basically collecting the data still somewhat manually. So in radiotherapy, and that was really what was triggering Brainlab's activity in that space, which is like for us about a quarter of our business, we're able to track also the physical world by different sensors, surface information, thermal information to deliver a very precise amount of radiation, which is a digital plan. And today, this information is not really used very effectively, although every single radiotherapy patient and 50% of all cancer patients are treated with radiotherapy have all their parameters in a digital sense, and that is not really systematically being used. So we built a registry for the American Association of Neurological Surgeons and the American Radiation Oncology Society, where we are extracting out of this plan hundreds of parameters in a digital way at a different normalized high level of quality. And that has basically more or less opened our eyes into when we want to look at better data for driving healthcare decisions, we need to look at right where the data is being generated. And then we realized, okay, well, that is something that is a little bit great if we get better radiotherapy data, but what's at the beginning of the diagnosis of a cancer patient is typically the diagnosis in a radiology report, and this is unfortunately in German, looks like this, but you can imagine that in the US it's probably not different, whether it's automatically dictated or so, it's still a text that is very difficult to systematically mine, because you don't only know what is being recorded, but you don't know what's not recorded in the report. So what you really need for cancer patients, would show the whole longitudinal information in a way that is depicted here, where you see basically a baseline, all the follow-up data in a very systematic and organized way. So how do you get there? So we looked and found a company where you have a linkage between the images and a best practice and guideline-based process where you go through a bunch of questions with a primary diagnosis, the secondary diagnosis that you can outline, label, and you always have a link between the images and a certain process of going through the diagnosis in a structured way. And so now all of a sudden you get a report that will always look the same, almost regardless of which radiologist would do the reading. And so we were, and that's a company, Mint Medical, that basically, as mentioned before, Brainlab acquired about a year ago. And this, for example, is what a COVID report would look like. And so basically in Germany, all university hospitals just have accumulated over 10,000 COVID patients that got a CT scan basically, and longitudinal data as part of a big detailed registry, all in a very computer processable way. So it's like easy to see how that is extremely powerful in basically determining which of those may have even hidden, maybe tumors and other things. So it's just giving a wealth of data and shows how, if the process of the generation of the data is structured itself, how powerful that is. And we have also basically bought a company that makes PROMs, patient-reported outcome measures, and we started to really link all of that basically together. We have software for orthopedic knee and hip templating, and just in knees and hips itself is globally 42 knee and hip registries, all run by 2 or 3 person companies. Nothing scales nationally, and certainly not on an international level. And that's where we believe we need to have a more elaborate infrastructure also for post-operative data, where we pull all of that together. We can have real-time dashboards, and basically also can aggregate data in basically volumetric sense. So this is a resectability map of brain tumors, where we've taken volumetric information from many patients and put it all in one system. So this is all those examples call for a more elaborate basically ecosystem, and such an ecosystem need to be patient-centric. So we also envisioned how in Europe a data sharing and a consent app would need to be constructed. So you could basically say, it's a big handicap being a German company, because Germany is the worst country in the world for having building a data ecosystem, because the implementation of the GDPR is the toughest. But even like a French company cannot figure out what Germany really means in their ruling, and with basically all the 16 different states being somewhat different. So basically, I think only a German company can actually get something going in Germany and scale it in Europe and also globally, that basically is putting patient privacy and protection from discrimination in the center, which is now also being adopted by actually a number of states in the US increasingly. And so this is more or less where we created an entire data ecosystem to use that wealth of data. Another activity that we've started is virtualizing some of our complex data systems by using Magic Leap. So we have joint planning experiences, and in the next effort with the latest version of the device, we're going to be overlaying that right onto the patient's anatomy so that we can augment the surgery without the big bulky navigation system to be built in. And finally, what you see here is Level X, a gaming company based in Chicago that we acquired 2 years ago, where you see here a bronchoscope and a patient that has inhaled a nail, and basically you're trying to train how do you need to aim the endoscope so they can remove the nail from that. So what you see here isn't basically a footage of an endoscope, but a computer simulation running on an iPhone, complete interactive, building basically a mental framework for how you can grab that nail. And basically this is something where we also have so-called virtual technique guides, basically that in the past in the textbook type form would depict how a total knee is being done. We made the whole thing totally interactive, again running on an iPhone, multiplayer ready, that multiple surgeons at different locations could run it jointly and basically interactively open up the knee, bend the knee, and basically go through step by step, the procedure. So what we have done here is, while I talked about how we have created a digital twin or digital copy of the patient's anatomy, we've created here a digital twin of the procedure. So when we talk about digitizing surgery, I think we can't just have a digital twin of the patient, but we also need to know what is the sequence of steps, and when have you maybe finished step 7 and are about to continue with step number 8. So basically doing those virtual technique guides and basically having a faster adoption of basically learning. This is basically our virtual learning environment, and the computer game industry has demonstrated how we can maybe learn how to manage a city or how you can run an army. And so there's like a lot of examples of how training can be accelerated by an ability of creating a sandbox where you can try things out yourself. And that's what we have essentially created here. And this is basically, when we talk about just digitizing basically surgery, there is really 3 things that you need. You need technology, you need data, and you need to work on the mindset of basically the surgeons. And so basically the last part that I've shown is basically our toolkit to basically drive change and roll out new procedures and new best practices to surgeons with those advanced technologies. And so that's in a nutshell what Brainlab is doing. And you can clearly see that we have moved beyond just basic catering to neurosurgery and creating a framework that has basically greater implication in the area of healthcare. And while our competitors may have been, I don't know, maybe Medtronic or Stryker or so to some extent in the products we started with, I think in the future we are basically looking more into where are we creating a platform company for digital health, which isn't like really something that is owned by one of the other platform companies. And there's a tremendous opportunity of shaping the future of healthcare and making basically the access more broadly, of driving up access to a broader audience.
That's fascinating. I'm wondering if everyone in the audience knew that they could get a video game that would teach them how to do knee surgery. I'm sure everybody's really excited about that. Are you marketing this to the home consumer or just to medical providers?
So right now we're just marketing that to really medical providers. But of course, basically, all my nieces and nephews have downloaded GastroX, and playing on removing basic polyps from the colon just before dinner, and just having fun doing that, and to the alienation of their parents. But basically, I think that there is a next generation also of surgeons that would also look at different ways of learning. And I think that also we're looking at potentially creating patient apps. So, for example, in the management of diabetes, I think that every neurodiagnosed diabetes patient needs to almost like develop a mental framework on how to really manage the disease. And basically, especially for pediatric patients, it's like a huge burden for parents. So if you normally could learn what takes you 6 months to do in 6 hours, I think that certainly would be a tremendous value and cost reduction in the healthcare system. So and we're envisioning building a complete curriculum for, I don't know, in a particular in one clinical subspecialty after the other, where we can really augment how to become a spinal surgeon or a neurosurgeon, etc., by supported by those tools.
It's like the game operation for the 21st century. I love it.
Yeah.
So a lot of your technology is built to work with existing healthcare infrastructure, with existing hospitals, with existing doctors. To what extent do you think MedTech is evolving in a direction where the technologies are complements to physicians, helping physicians, facilitating what physicians do, versus substitutes for physicians?
I don't really see any technology that I think is a particular threat to a physician in terms of substituting them. I think it's all enhancing their skills, and I think a fool with a tool is still a fool. And I also don't think that there is really a replacement of the physician. That what we'll see is a shift of procedures. There's maybe new types of procedures that are being developed that are maybe highly automated, image guided, etc., which basically shift maybe things that were very skill dependent to something that is basically more a computerized, standardized procedure. So there's going to be some shift that we can see there. But I think that also the bigger shift that we see in terms of the infrastructure that you mentioned is that a lot of the traditional MedTech companies are trying to almost abuse software. They're creating closed ecosystems, and basically, if you have a non-differentiated product, you're adding a lot of software to it to give basically that differentiated software some artificial unique characteristics. And but it basically screws up the scalability of software. And I think the wonderful thing about software, which got me motivated to get into software in the first place, is that it can almost like infinitely scale. And now you're creating those island solutions where basically a hospital may have a closet of different computer systems that basically will in for different procedures, but there is basically not a focus on interoperability. And basically a lot of the medical device companies basically investing a lot of effort of creating basically something that is actually hindering interoperability. And that, I think, is a very a big problem. And we're trying to virtualize a lot of our technology to be less dependent on a capital equipment sales cycle, which is also, I think, a key topic of the circular economy. That in MedTech, replacing a complete physical unit and replacing it for another unit has always been the pattern. And how can there be more a software layer to do that? So for our digital OR system, we have been dependent on, whenever a hospital builds a new hospital wing or a new surgical building, then it's an opportunity to basically pitch that product. The sales cycle can be 5 years from the initial project till it's being installed and ready to go. And so we basically thought that how can we virtualize that? And we had a project that had the internal code name Brainlab TV, because similar to how Apple TV can plug into any TV set to turn it into a streaming TV, we have created a little box that's about that size that you plug into any existing screen, and you just unplug your video source, plug it in between, and then it will feed through the video signal, but it will also send the video signal somewhere else, and it can put a software layer on top of that. So you can basically go into any existing OR, even a 20-year-old system that has no digital infrastructure, take that screen, plug in our system, and we can kind of just hijack that system within 5 minutes. And and it's a, whatever, say less than $10,000 box that turns almost like every screen into a digital OR system. And we're just, we just completed the software for that. And so that will be basically our platform to almost regardless of what the infrastructure of the hospital is, to jump in and find a platform for deploying our software with basically minimal footprint.
So you're talking about a lot of really cutting edge new technology. You're a very innovative company, but everyone in this Zoom room can think of great technologies that didn't take off, right? So what do you think are some of the bigger challenges in the development and really adoption of digitization and AI in healthcare in the space of surgery or otherwise?
So I think that there's a couple of things. So first of all, AI is like, I think it's easy to develop an AI algorithm that's impressive and just makes for an impressive demo. It's much more difficult to deploy that in a clinical product, and I think I see that increasingly getting tough. So it's not almost like a matter of who has the smartest AI algorithm, because that's changing all the time. So I think the challenge will really be validating and deploying basically the technology. And we're also looking at how can our technology really help in that effort. And I think that and also the limiting factor is the regulatory landscape is getting more difficult, especially in Europe. And from a regulatory point of view, we need better data. So therefore, creating this data ecosystem, I think, is really important, because then this way, if you generate real world data, they can also monitor and validate any existing AI algorithms, and to which extent do they actually produce better results, or maybe may distort basically maybe a treatment through a implied bias. And which is basically one challenge. But also I think that level X can basically increase, make the growth curve steeper, because the value of any new technology is, how steeply can you ramp up that technology. And if you have a tool that is basically almost like a zero footprint running on an iPhone, a training or learning experience that you can almost like put virtually in the hands of every customer on the planet, even before the product is ready, is an ability to almost like front load that learning experience and giving a customer a hands-on experience that otherwise would be extremely difficult and expensive to deploy. And finally, to basically allow more startups to succeed in with their effort. That's why we're creating Snake OS, almost like the same way of how AWS has basically enabled many startups with a basic idea to basically create a scalable cloud-based infrastructure and basically deploy a lot of business ideas with limited infrastructure requirements. We're trying to do the same in healthcare. So if somebody has a better AI algorithm, then we will have an infrastructure of visualizing that, and also basically fundamentally to also deploy that. So we're not having we're very liberal, so we don't have a closed system. We have open interfaces. So basically the fact that we have 6,000 hospitals, 6,200 hospitals using our technology, we basically want to give access to them essentially to anybody who wants to develop technology based on Snake OS and deploy that. And I think this is like how all platform companies really operate, to be open and open interfaces, interoperability, very different than the rest of the MedTech world works, and to which extent we'll be able to succeed with that, like we'll see. So I think Brainlab is also basically is a share company, but privately held. I personally own 50% of it, so we are decently profitable, which gives us the flexibility to do what we want. But also doing what we want basically means we can invest in areas that are driven by kind of just maybe a gut feeling that there is like value to be created, without having a very concise business plan on how to basically make money out of that. For example, everything around this data ecosystem is basically on the Brainlab side an expensive hobby, because especially in Europe, it's very unclear with some of the pending legislation if it's even permissible to basically make money by data. And I think it's also not about taking over the toll booth, which I think is not ethical from a data perspective. We'd rather support data models or business models which look at generating incremental value for basically physicians and their patients through generating data. But we haven't really figured out how to do that. But I'm confident that we'll figure something out.
So you're you're very passionate, it seems, about like regulatory frameworks, data sharing, interoperability. Do you have a sense of, I mean, there are trade-offs, right? We want to protect data security, we want to protect patient confidentiality, we want to reward innovation, right? There are reasons to have sort of guardrails on how widely data can be shared. Have you seen a country that has what you think of as a model framework for balancing these competing needs? Or do you have in mind a model framework for balancing the needs of data security, rewarding innovation, generating evidence on value, and facilitating robust entry by innovators?
So I think that it's still, I think, in its infancy, because I think that the US has been like super liberal in, say, anything goes. I think some states have basically implemented a few more strict rules. In Germany, I think the nightmare is that the GDPR requirements have been implemented by every state differently. There's different state hospital laws. There's like the different church run hospitals have even like additional rules. So in Germany, there's the data protection oversight is split over 100 different entities. Very difficult to manage, and there's almost a contradiction in the way of how it's interpreted, and which is almost like the other extreme. But I also don't think that there is a real threat necessary, like in maybe data abuse. I think it's basically more a question of is there discrimination from basically, is there protection from discrimination, etc. And I think therefore it's important that companies that provide maybe insurance and chat functions and other things would almost like have Chinese walls and a complete separation for basically the part of the business that's managing healthcare data. And while I think that especially, what we find in Asia, it's like normal that the company that has your life insurance and bank account and chat function and, essentially owns your whole life in a digital sense, that's probably not maybe, I think, equivalent with at least European or Western, values. And so therefore, I think that basically been having that separation between the different business sectors, I think would be an important architectural point. And the second point, in my opinion, would be to put the patient's basic consent at center. So basically, it's sometimes hospitals are more or less selling patient data. I think large hospital networks basically get the patient to more or less consent in the small print to, doing with their data whatever they want to. But I think that that's also, I think, for me, questionable whether that is, ethical. I think that really putting the patient at the center, having the patient almost give a universal declaration of what they want to do with the data, which we try to mock up with a, universal data sharing consent form, where you basically, and it's not rocket science. If, you put yourself in the shoes of a patient, and, I could do that even, although, I've been luckily not, had any serious, disease yet, where I would say, if I were a patient, what would I want to do with my data? Who would I want to share it with, and under which terms or not? And defining that in a universal way, and having an infrastructure where that is being, maintained is like also important. I think it's important that you have a separation between, or you avoid any conflict of interest between the entity that's collecting the data and the entity that's using the data. So I think Europe is going overboard by demanding in the basically European Data Governance Act that is a whole a legal separation between the data holder or the data intermediary and the data user. And I think at least there needs to be whoever is a data intermediary should be privileged on the use of the data, and there needs to be almost an independent body and basically checking if certain formal requirements for the use of data have been met. But I think that if Europe is can and I think they're backpedaling a little bit on the GDPR requirements at this point, and they're issuing the European Health Data Space guidelines later this year. And if they get this right, and I've had the privilege to join the discussion at the European level, in several formats, I think it can actually be the blueprint for how in Europe and maybe in the world in the future data governance can be done, and that it can actually be driving innovation and be patient-centric. And I think that both of those points are achievable.
Okay, well, I should turn it over to the Q&A with the audience in just 1 minute, but since I'm in the catbird seat, I get to ask one more question. What do you see as the biggest areas for disruption in the next 5 years for software and hardware solutions in MedTech? Everybody get your checkbooks out.
Yeah, good point. I think there's a number of things in play. So, hard to say, but in any case, software and data and technology from Brainlab will be an essential component. So, the way I look at that is we almost like will be an enabling component in the same way of how maybe Microsoft have basically 20 years ago basically benefit from everybody finding new ways of what to do with a home computer, so to speak. Basically, I think the brain will benefit from basically a growing demand in digital tools, and I think that this big challenge in turning surgery digital is going to be to a large extent driven by making the patient model dynamic. So that's maybe for Brainlab, I'd say the biggest technical challenge, because if you think about it, we have a static patient model. It's a CT scan, MRI scan that's taken prior to surgery. But if you look at abdominal surgery, the minute you make the first cut, everything changes. So you would, in theory, need to update the model. And for all the robotic surgery from, I don't know, maybe the Da Vinci, Auris, Covidian, name it, it's a telemanipulator, but the true potential, it can only be unlocked if it actually has a dynamic patient model that continuously and progressively is being updated. And I think we're pretty close in how we can achieve that, because while we build our 3D model in the background, we actually get a finite element model that can pretty much be updated all the time. And we have that in clinical use in neurosurgery, where we can simulate what an intraoperative MRI would look like based on just some very crude additional information that being collected during surgery. And if we now bring that to abdominal surgery, that I think will unlock a number of different other components. But I mean, I think there are so many other interesting components, but I think it's more or less maybe in oncology, it's also breaking the barriers between the different subspecialties. I think that clinical oncology, surgical oncology, and radiation oncology are very much still with very little touch points. Clinical oncology thinks that they got all the solutions and basically all the they're going to cure cancer, but I think that it's also becoming increasingly clear there isn't a simple cure, and basically getting better data, personalizing medicine, and basically having a better way of just having the perfect optimized personal plan across all the different say oncological subspecialties. Same true for degenerative diseases. I think it's all going to be data driven, and I don't think there's a good enough way of how the data is being captured, combined, aggregated across institutions, patients, etc. And so that's what we're trying to do as well.
Right. If only there were a platform for that. Okay, I'll relay some questions from the audience. Rihanna says, thanks for your time. How does your technology fit, if at all, with some robotics platforms like Stryker's Mako or Zimmer's Rosa?
Okay, so in general, I think that all those robotic platforms need better, say, patient models and digital models. And I think that the accuracy of all those robots, it's just a tool, they can implement something. But basically the accuracy of that procedure is going to be at the end dependent on everything else being added basically to that system. So for example, a very precise registration, capturing the position of the patient in space, and having better 3D images. So what Brainlab really does in its system is basically we have, for example, LoopX that can generate better 3D models of the patient to start with. So we basically see all the robotic efforts as I think an interesting and worthwhile procedure. Sometimes the robotic solutions are a hammer looking for a nail, and basically but I think most of them successfully found their nail. And but nevertheless, I think that some of the technology from Brainlab and some of the other components, in fact, can provide benefits and basically make the procedure basically better. Which I think that every surgery starts with a plan, a very precise patient model, and also a report. And the data that's being generated after the procedure will be the input for the next and the follow-on procedure. And that's, I think, where also Brainlab come into place. And the robot is just this one little step in the process.
We have a question from Elise. As a physician, I can say that healthcare is very conservative as a field. What barriers to entry in healthcare have you encountered, and how have you addressed them?
It is very conservative, and basically, I think that we have for 30 years suffered through that, especially in neurosurgery. And basically, neurosurgery was probably maybe for us a natural area to focus on first, because a lot of technologies from CTs to MRIs and microscopes, etc., have been first adopted in neurosurgery, which I think helped us. But I think that in general, this getting the concept or the idea of why a technology would do or provide a better treatment, I think level X is helping us a lot to basically, get a patient, get a physician basically sensitive on a particular challenge. So we can basically, replicate maybe their existing way of doing things. So we start with basically creating a digital copy of their existing workflows. And then we're adding basically then the modern tools, and we're giving them a virtual environment where they can try something out.
I'm going to ask a follow-up question about that one. Is this, when you get in touch with physicians, is this a push strategy or a pull strategy? Because physicians are busy, burnout is high. They're doing a lot of other things, and adopting the latest, greatest technology is not always going to be on their radar, even if they want to, right? There's just a lot of forces pulling them in many different directions. So how do you try and get the word out and get adoption high?
I think that I almost like have seen the whole thing like really almost like flip or turn around, where basically it was really almost like we had to basically get them to basically get excited. But we now see almost like the opposite, that we're getting approached by a lot of companies and physician startups, big tech companies or so, that almost like use Brainlab as their partner to deploy some new technology. And based on the fact that we work with 6,000 hospitals, including the majority of universities in Japan, I think there's 96 universities and 92 of them work with Brainlab. So whenever they have some interesting new idea, they almost like by default contact Brainlab, like, here's an idea, can you help us to provide the software solution to deploy that? And in those areas that have been notoriously low, at a low level of digital say involvement, let's say hip arthroscopy, for example, they are so starved for digital tools that they're totally excited almost like about anything we can provide them with. And they feel that they are a little bit left behind in the digital transformation, and it's writing on the wall that everyone in their subspecialty needs to basically embrace new tools. And if we just focus on basically easing the documentation effort, I think that nowadays any physician is basically more or less frustrated because they spend 60% of the time just on documentation. And if we say, okay, we have a way of not only getting better documentation at the procedure, but we're able to digitize the process so that by the time you're done in your procedure, you have everything readily available. That's something that resonates with everybody and gets everybody's attention. And that's more or less the trick of how we get more hooked on our digital tools.
Makes sense. Anonymous says, thoughts about applications for rural hospitals, diagnostic applications too? Yeah.
So obviously, I think not only in rural hospitals, but also in basic emerging markets, I think it's for us also important how we can, in general, make our technology more accessible. And so basically right now, we started with a lot of the teaching hospitals and bigger hospitals, but basically a lot of the efforts will basically virtualize the technology with this, what I call Brainlab TV, as this project, virtualizing basically a digital R infrastructure with Magic Leap, where all of a sudden you don't have to wheel in $100,000 device, but you put up a $5,000 headset, and that becomes a navigation system for a more simple, maybe outpatient procedure. Is basically really changing the way of how technology can be deployed. So maybe Brainlab in its business model isn't the right party to deliver those other applications for, say, more simple type of procedures, but that's why we're creating this framework that others can do so. So I don't necessarily pick what is the right, say, cardiology application that we should, develop. Instead, I want to have 50 cardiology companies develop their technology or their next big thing based on Brainlab, on a Brainlab framework, and basically then they compete with our technology for basically, the highest market share in that space. And I think this is also how we over time will get our technology deployed in basically smaller hospitals, rural hospitals, emerging markets, and basically also the accessibility of training now basically being on an iPhone is basically then really the way of how we can make also the introduction of the technology more broadly accessible. We also are using this Bus Virtual to virtualize the presence of basically support in the OR, whether it be a technical support of an implant rep, or whether it is a clinical support of an expert in a complex trauma case that a rural hospital has at 2 o'clock in the morning, where at the press of a button with those systems, you may get the world's renowned expert to help you in that procedure by coaching you through the procedure. And we're also investing in an infrastructure to support that.
Arena asks, can you touch on what is important for data collection? Also, do you see more RPM in data collections, or PROMS will continue to be the best way to collect good quality data? I don't know what those acronyms mean myself.
I don't know either, but I think that a lot of the discussion on data collection is defining data formats that you should basically more or less come up with. But if you don't understand the process of how the data has been created, then the data almost becomes meaningless. So if somebody would hand me, all the data on all hospitals, all hospitals' hard disks, then basically there would be a problem. Okay, it means basically patient-reported outcome measures. So basically, so like we just acquired a company, to do that. But what that company in fact does is they have an engine that can generate hundreds of forms in a very easy way. And we've actually started to deploy those forms to basically have data being captured at the point of care. And I think that that's really important, that basically you have a customized form when you, for example, do a neurological examination, we say weakness of, left arm, yes, no, whatever, you need to capture that information. And if you basically do that just in a text format, that's very difficult for computers to process. If you have a simple questionnaire for that subspecialty where they click through with probably less effort than what is being recorded today, it can still generate a clinical note in the same format than you would do today, but it will collect data in the raw format in a better way. And then, of course, that all has to be basically supported by basically patient-reported outcome measures that also will collect the data over time. But you need really both, I believe. And basically, I think that that's why we're just looking at the full spectrum. And basically, at the end, there also may be additional sensor data that you get by basically then the smart, watches, etc. So I think that will be also important in the future. But I think our data ecosystem should just be open to any type of data that you can grab.
I have a quick follow-up question about that. Is Brainlab itself involved in the sort of medical R&D here, right? So suppose that you have some medical device that is collecting a lot of physiological data about a knee replacement or something like that, spinal fusion. And then that gets combined with patient-reported outcomes, via some platform like Brainlab. Are you involved in the R&D to try and figure out how the physiological markers that previously haven't been recorded in this level of richness are being translated into patient-reported outcomes, or are you leaving that to other entities using your platform?
we want to actually leave the data analysis to other entities using our platform. We just want to provide them better tools and how they can basically mine and analyze that data. So basically, we're investing into analytics tools. But I think that foremost, all the thousands of systems that we have out there, first of all, collect data and keep it and store it on those systems. But what we're just now, adding is we say, well, that's a waste, and the basically secondary use of the data is, I think, very meaningful for providing the adequate healthcare for our children and grandchildren. And for that reason, it's almost like an ethical, basically, a duty to find a better way for, creating an environment in which that secondary use is possible in a safe way. But I think that we deliberately, didn't focus on Brainlab being the consumer of that data, but rather providing that ecosystem. And we won't rule out that there's also applications where we would like to look at the data, but our access to that data shouldn't be privileged over anybody else's access to the data. And we would need to go through the same review process of basically what is our data access and is it in line with the patient's consent, etc. So which I think is really crucial for privacy protection and privacy preservation.
Well, I think that puts us right at our time. So I just, on behalf of everyone that's in this Zoom room, want to thank you, Stefan, for coming and telling us about Brainlab and for telling us where you think this technology is going and how we can maybe help it get there faster. Really appreciate you taking the time and telling us about your fascinating work. So.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. And basically, I think that also, your basically associated medical school is also long-term a good use of our technology. And basically, I come to New York all the time. So maybe in the future, there actually can be a physical meeting with basically, some of the audience or so. And basically, but it was basically the first time that I actually presented here. And let's see where we can take it from there. And okay, then maybe see you next time in person.
Yeah, I would love that. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thanks for coming, everyone.